In my previous video, I showed you guys this game PC that I had bought for just 20 euros. Given that I had to add my own storage, it's now worth about 100 times that much, I guess. So sorry if that makes you feel clickbaited. Anyway, in that video I struggled to get Windows 10 or 11 running on this machine, as it blue screened as soon as I connected it to the internet. A lot of people told me to try a USB network adapter, but before going that route, I decided to update its BIOS and well, I suppose we can now see how well it does in Windows. Let's compare it to the results we got in Linux after the intro. For who hasn't seen the previous video, this is a 4th gen Intel i5 PC with an NVIDIA GTX 960 GPU and 8GB of DDR3 memory. There was no storage in it, so I added a 265GB SSD of my own. So after updating the BIOS, it booted straight into the Windows 10 install from the end of the previous video. Since that has blue screened a few times before, I decided to wipe the drive and reinstall one last time. The IoT variant of Windows 11 this time, because why not? Yes, take all of this unallocated space on the drive. Oh shit, forgot to remove the network cable again. Let's restart and pretend that didn't happen. No, I don't have internet. What makes you think that? There we are. Let's plug it in. See if it indeed keeps working this time. Cool! So it installed a driver for that communications controller, leaving only the SM bus controller driverless. Installing the latest Intel chipset drivers didn't fix that, but after installing the Windows 10 package from MSI's driver page for this board later, it all seems fine. Get the latest driver for the GTX 960, which is from June this year, so pretty recent. Let's get and install Steam as well while we're waiting. Get the same games we tested last time. Oh, and some benchmark tools, of course. This'll be my very first time benchmarking with a new Geekbench 7. Alright, let's start with Furmark. On OpenGL, we're seeing 37 FPS on average, collecting 2242 points. That's quite a bit better than the result we got on Linux. We only got 33 FPS and a score of 2007 on there. On Vulkan the test black screened on Windows, so I cannot compare that sadly. Since this is the first test on Geekbench 7, I retested Linux as well, as you can't compare two completely different versions to each other. As expected, the CPU comes out a little better on Linux with a single core score of 1258 compared to 1205 on Windows, and a dual core score of 3805 compared to 3531 on Windows. The OpenCL test for this GTX 960 is a tad better on Linux as well, with a score of 18,929 on Linux and 18,590 on Windows. The Vulkan test failed on Linux though, which is probably why it scores less than half of what it does on Windows. So I installed Geekbench 6 on Windows and, interestingly, got a slightly better score on Linux for that one as well, with 20,088 points on Linux and 19,811 on Windows. Not what I expected. The CUDA test I couldn't get to run on Linux at all, so there's nothing to compare there. CUDA seems to be working though, as Blender was able to use it without issues. So, what about games? Mouse PI for hire, 1080p low, provided us a mid-70s average frame rate with 1% lows in the low 50s on Linux. On Windows 11, we're talking some 10 FPS more, both average and low. Batman Arkham Knight, on a mixture of low, normal and high settings because of VRAM, benchmarked as 79 max, 50 average and 33 minimum frame rate on Linux. On Windows, all these are quite a bit higher, with a 64 FPS average and a whopping 53 minimum. That's 20 FPS more than Linux on the most demanding scenes. You're gonna feel those. WRC7 at 1080p medium settings produced some 70 FPS average and 57 FPS lows. Windows again does a lot better with an 83 FPS average and 1% lows down to 68 FPS. To run Doom Eternal on Linux, I needed some startup options to temper VRAM usage. None of that on Windows, it just launches. At 1080p low settings, I got a 60 FPS average and 1% lows down to 35 FPS on Linux. On Windows, we're seeing 64 FPS average and 54 FPS lows. That's again gonna feel a lot better on Windows with almost 20 FPS higher lows. Euro Truck Simulator 2 at 1080p high gave us a mid-60s frame rate on Linux with 1% lows down to the high 30s. That's another big win for win, 86 FPS average and 63 FPS low. Should be way more playable on Windows like this. Black Mesa at 1080p medium did 66 FPS average on Linux and 1% lows down to 45 FPS. Windows hovers around 100 FPS average and lows down to 55. In case you're wondering if DXVK translation is the issue on Linux, using DXVK we're still getting some mid-90s FPS and lows down to 50 on Windows. Yes, it's less, but it's still a bit more than Linux was able to produce. A game that doesn't need any translation on Linux, Super Tux God, benchmarked a 60 FPS typical frame rate and a steady frame rate of 52 FPS on Linux at a 4K resolution. Same settings on Windows gives us 90 FPS typical and a 67 FPS steady. Whoops. I guess if you're a gamer, this GTX 960 really is a lot better on Windows. Geekbench showed us that in terms of raw power, the card does very well on Linux though. Looking at the footage I made on Linux a few weeks ago, it doesn't show a CPU bottleneck and the GPU is fully utilized in most situations. So I guess the Windows drivers just handle 3D rendering a little better. That's all I've got for you today. On to the next project. Thank you very much for watching. Until next time.